My name is Zara Mendez. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I would have described myself as the dependable one. I live in San Diego, California. I work as a senior operations analyst for a mid-sized healthcare company. My job is to notice what other people overlook: small discrepancies, missing approvals, quiet inconsistencies in spreadsheets that don't scream for attention but change everything if left unchecked. Most people who meet me describe me the same way: calm, practical, and responsible. I'm not the loud one in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. I listen, I process, I remember. And because of that, I've often been underestimated. In my family, I was the strong one, the low-maintenance daughter, the one who didn't need help, the one who understood when money was tight, the one who would be fine. My younger brother, Mateo, was different. Charismatic, charming, impulsive. He had big dreams and bigger emotions. He also had a way of making every room revolve around him without trying very hard. If you had asked me a year ago whether I felt loved, I would have said yes. If you had asked me whether I felt valued, I would have hesitated. This story isn't about shouting or dramatic confrontations. It isn't about revenge. There were no smashed plates, no public scenes, no legal threats thrown across a dinner table. What happened was quieter than that. One afternoon, I logged into my savings account, the account I had been building since I was 19. Every bonus, every overtime check, every vacation I didn't take, every upgrade I postponed. It was my safety net, my future home. My proof to myself that I didn't need to depend on anyone. And it was gone. Not stolen by a hacker, not lost in an investment. Spent, transferred over months into an account I didn't recognize. One that, I later learned, was tied to a luxury apartment purchase. For my brother, an apartment I had never heard about. A decision I had never been consulted on. A transaction that required signatures I did not remember giving. They hadn't yelled. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even explained. They had simply used my entire life savings to buy my brother a new home. Without saying a word. What I'm about to share isn't just about money. It's about the roles we accept without realizing. It's about how silence can look like strength to others, and like permission. It's about what happens when the reliable one finally starts observing instead of absorbing. I won't dramatize this. I won't exaggerate. I'll tell you exactly how it unfolded. The small signs I ignored, the moment I understood the pattern, and the quiet decision that changed the direction of my life. Because sometimes the loudest transformation doesn't make a sound. Have you ever realized that the people who depend on your strength might also be quietly using it? In my family, I was never the fragile one. That title belonged to my brother. Mateo was 3 years younger than me, but from the time he was 10, my parents spoke about him like he was navigating some invisible battlefield. He was sensitive. He was creative. He was misunderstood. If he struggled in school, it was because the system didn't appreciate his brilliance. If he quit a job, it was because his manager didn't recognize his potential. If he overspent, it was because he was investing in himself. When I succeeded, it was expected. When I struggled, it was private. I don't say that with bitterness, it's just the pattern. I was the daughter who didn't slam doors. The daughter who filled out scholarship forms alone. The daughter who compared interest rates before opening her first credit card. My parents would introduce me to relatives with a proud smile. This is Zara, she's independent. She's always been independent. Independent in our house meant self-sufficient. Self-sufficient meant you don't ask. By 22, I was already helping my mom review insurance forms. By 25, I was the one my dad called when he couldn't remember the password to an account. I became the quiet administrator of the family, organizing documents, setting reminders, explaining financial terms at the dinner table in plain language. I thought that was trust. Looking back, I understand it was also access. When Mateo needed help with rent during one of his transitional periods, my parents would sigh in private and then step in. When I received a promotion, they would say, "See, you're fine, we never worry about you." That sentence used to make me proud. We never worry about you. It sounded like confidence. It sounded like respect. It felt like love in a practical form. But what it really meant was this: we assume you'll absorb whatever comes. At family gatherings, if something needed to be handled, reservations, splitting bills, planning logistics, I would naturally take over. No one asked me to. It just settled onto my shoulders. And when I did it well, it became permanent. Reliable people are rarely questioned. If Mateo forgot a birthday, everyone laughed. That's just him. If I ever forgot anything, which was rare, it was surprising. You? That's not like you. There was no malice in it, no cruelty, just a quiet expectation that I would continue being the stable one, the calm one, the one who had it together. Even financially, the dynamic was subtle. I started saving aggressively at 19 because I had watched my parents struggle during the recession. I told myself I would never be cornered by money. Every paycheck, I transferred a fixed percentage into a separate high-yield account. I tracked every deposit in my leather journal, date, amount, purpose. My parents knew I was good with money. They praised me for it. They would even joke, "If we ever need a financial advisor, we'll just hire Zara." I smiled when they said that. I didn't realize they weren't joking. To them, I wasn't just their daughter. I was the contingency plan. And contingency plans don't get consulted, they get used. The thing about invisibility isn't that people can't see you. It's that they see you as a function, and functions don't require permission. That was who I was to them. Not the fragile one, not the dreamer, not the investment. The backup system. The one who would be fine. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a missing lump sum or a suspicious phone call. It was something so small that, at the time, I almost dismissed it as a technical glitch. I was 28. I had just crossed the six-figure mark in my savings account, a milestone I'd quietly worked toward for nearly a decade. I remember sitting at my kitchen counter that Sunday morning, coffee cooling beside me, refreshing the banking app just to see the number again. $103,442.17. It wasn't flashy money, not in California, but it was security. It was a choice. A week later, I logged in again to update my journal. The number read $98,442.17. $5,000 gone. I didn't panic. My first instinct was logic. Maybe an automatic transfer I forgot. Maybe I moved it to another investment account. I checked everything. Nothing. There was a transfer, authorized, to a linked family account I recognized. An account my parents had once used to temporarily consolidate funds when they were refinancing their home years ago. I stared at the word authorized longer than I'd like to admit, because technically it was. When I was 23, I had signed a limited access authorization so I could help my parents manage paperwork during a particularly chaotic year. My father had health complications. My mother was overwhelmed. It made sense at the time to allow cross-visibility between certain accounts. We were a family. We trusted each other. I told myself there had to be an explanation. So I called my mom. Her voice was light, casual. "Oh, sweetheart, yes, we meant to mention that." Meant to. She explained that Mateo had an opportunity. A short-term investment in a business idea with a friend. He needed liquidity quickly. They didn't want to take out a loan with high interest. It would be temporary, just bridging funds. He would pay it back. $5,000 isn't life-changing for you, she added gently, but it really helps him. The sentence landed softly, too softly. Not life-changing for you. I didn't say anything sharp. I didn't raise my voice. I even heard myself respond, "Okay, I just would have appreciated a heads up." And she said, "Of course, you're right. We should have told you." That was it. No argument, no tension, no dramatic confrontation. Just a small cut. Later that night, I wrote the withdrawal in my leather journal. I didn't label it as betrayal. I labeled it family transfer, pending return. I told myself this was what families did. Help each other, support each other. Mateo would return it. He always talked about his big break. Maybe this was it. But something else lingered. Not anger. Observation. No one had asked. They hadn't framed it as a request. It had already happened. The decision was complete by the time I was informed. And everyone spoke as though it was reasonable. When I mentioned it to a close friend weeks later, she frowned and said, "Wait, they can just move money like that?" I heard myself defend them. "It's not like that, it's just temporary, and they've helped me before." Which was technically true. In emotional ways, in practical ways. But financially, I had never asked them for anything beyond a place to live during college. Still, I rationalized. $5,000 wasn't catastrophic. The account still felt strong. My plan wasn't derailed. And if I made this into something bigger, it would sound petty. So I absorbed it. But I also adjusted something quietly. I changed my passwords. Not confrontationally, not dramatically, just quietly. I didn't revoke access. That would have felt accusatory. I simply tightened things. Added extra verification layers. Shifted how alerts were sent. I told myself it was just good financial hygiene. But deep down, I think I knew. The first time someone crosses a boundary without asking, it's rarely the last. And the dangerous part isn't the amount. It's the normalization. Because once $5,000 becomes acceptable, the conversation changes. And in my family, conversations rarely happen before decisions. They happened after. Mateo never paid back the $5,000. Not fully. There were partial transfers, 1,000 here, 500 there, each accompanied by enthusiastic updates about his progress. The business idea evolved twice, then dissolved, then transformed into something else entirely. The urgency faded. The expectation that it would be repaid faded faster. No one said, "We're not paying you back." They simply stopped talking about it. And I stopped asking. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive loudly. It softens the edges until the original shape of the boundary becomes unclear. About 6 months later, another transfer appeared. Smaller this time. $1,200. Tuition for a certification Mateo had decided would open doors. Again, already completed it before I knew. Again, framed as temporary. "You know he's trying," my dad said gently when I paused on the phone. I did know that. But trying and planning are not the same thing. I began noticing subtle shifts in language. When it was Mateo's ambition, it was described as investment. When it was my savings, it was described as flexibility. "She's good with money," my mom told an aunt at a birthday dinner. "Zara's always been smart about these things." I smiled across the table, but inside something tightened. Smart about these things. As if intelligence automatically meant consent. I started tracking everything more carefully. Every withdrawal, every conversation. Not because I was preparing for war, but because clarity calmed me. Documentation made emotion less overwhelming. Still, I rationalized. It's family, it's temporary. It's not that much compared to the total. The human brain is remarkable at protecting relationships. We rewrite discomfort into generosity. We reframe intrusion into support. We call it understanding instead of imbalance. The most dangerous thought I had during that period wasn't anger. It was this: if I push back too hard, I'll look selfish. That belief kept me silent longer than anything else. I didn't want to be the sister who cared more about money than family. I didn't want to create tension. I didn't want to appear ungrateful for the emotional support my parents had given me throughout my life. So I minimized my own discomfort. Every time a transfer happened, always under the threshold of something that would cause alarm, I would tell myself, "This is the last time." But the pattern wasn't random. It was incremental. 5,000, 1,200, 2,000 for bridge rent, 800 for emergency car repairs. Individually, each one was defensible. Together, they formed something else. I began to notice something even more subtle. No one asked Mateo to explain his plans in detail. No one requested timelines. No one asked for accountability updates beyond vague enthusiasm. But when I once mentioned wanting to invest in a small condo in the future, my dad asked 3 follow-up questions about market timing and risk. It wasn't malicious, it was unconscious. They trusted me to be responsible. They protected him from responsibility. And somehow, those two things coexisted without anyone noticing the imbalance. Except me. There was a dinner one evening. Nothing special, just Sunday pasta. When Mateo casually said, "I'm lucky I have you guys. Most people don't have this kind of support system." He said it warmly, gratefully. He wasn't wrong, but he didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at our parents, as if the support came only from them. I felt something unfamiliar that night. Not jealousy, not anger. Erasure. I had become infrastructure, essential, invisible. That was the moment I understood something uncomfortable. When people grow accustomed to your strength, they stop recognizing the cost of it. And when you don't voice that cost, they assume it's zero. So I stayed quiet. But I stopped believing it was accidental. It didn't happen in a single conversation. No one gathered around a table and said, "Zara, this is who you are to us now." Roles in families are rarely assigned out loud. They're absorbed, reinforced, repeated until they feel like a personality instead of positioning. I was the stable one, which slowly translated into the resourceful one, which eventually translated into the available one. There's a difference. Stability is a trait, availability is access. And I had made myself accessible in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I was the one who read the fine print. So documents came to me. I was the one who understood interest rates. So financial decisions were explained to me. I was the one who stayed calm. So emotional storms moved around me instead of toward me. And when money was needed, it moved quietly through me too. Not always directly. Sometimes it was framed as temporary reallocation. Sometimes it was described as family pooling. Sometimes it wasn't framed at all, just executed and explained later. But the unspoken logic was consistent. Zara will understand. Zara doesn't panic. Zara doesn't need as much. There was one moment that clarified it for me. My parents were discussing Mateo's idea of moving into a better area to network with the right crowd. He believed the environment shaped opportunity. It wasn't an unreasonable thought, but the rent difference was significant. I asked carefully, "Has he built up savings for that move?" The room went quiet for half a second too long. My mother smiled, the same gentle, smoothing smile she used when trying to keep the peace. "Sweetheart, you know he's not wired like you. Not wired like you." It was meant as a compliment, but it revealed something deeper. I wasn't just responsible, I was the comparison standard. And comparison standards don't get accommodated. They set the bar. If Mateo overspent, he was learning. If I questioned spending, I was practical. Practical people don't disrupt the system, they sustain it. I began to see how neatly I fit into the family ecosystem. Mateo generated motion, ideas, crises, ambition, urgency. My parents generated protection, cushioning his falls, funding his transitions, and I generated stability, absorbing the financial aftershock. It was almost elegant in its balance, except that balance requires consent. One evening, while reorganizing some shared documents at my parents' house, I noticed how often my name appeared on backup authorizations, secondary contacts, emergency access, contingency planning. Mateo's name rarely did. He was the priority, I was the fallback. That realization didn't enrage me. It clarified me, because fallback systems are never celebrated. They're expected to function flawlessly, and when they do, no one applauds the absence of disaster. They just move forward. I also began noticing how often my parents framed financial decisions with phrases like, "You'll be fine. You're ahead anyway. You don't really need this right now." Each sentence positioned my needs as flexible. The more capable you appear, the more negotiable your boundaries become in other people's minds. And I had spent my entire life appearing capable. I wasn't the daughter they worried about. I was the daughter they relied on. And reliance, when left unchecked, quietly becomes entitlement. Still, I didn't confront them, because at that point, I hadn't yet admitted something to myself. I was participating in the role. Every time I rationalized. Every time I stayed calm instead of clear. Every time I prioritized harmony over honesty. I reinforced the system, but something inside me had started to shift. Not anger, not resentment, just awareness. And awareness, once it settles in, doesn't leave. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. There was no shocking email, no accidental confession. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting in my car, outside a coffee shop after work, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. I had just gotten off the phone with my mother. She sounded tired, not upset, just stretched thin. "Your brother found a place he really loves," she said. "It's in a great building, safe, modern, the kind of environment that could really motivate him." I remember staring at the windshield as she talked. "He's thinking long-term now, settling down. This could be good for him." There was a pause, the kind that carries a request without wording it. I waited. She continued, softer this time. "We're just trying to figure out the down payment structure." I didn't respond immediately. I knew that tone. I'd heard it before, the gentle circling before the ask. The assumption was wrapped in hesitation. But this time, something inside me didn't rush to reassure. Instead, I asked a simple question. "How much?" The number she said didn't register at first. It floated in the air between us, abstract. Then it landed. It wasn't 5,000. It wasn't 1,200. It was more than I had ever transferred at once. I felt something unfamiliar. Not panic, not even anger, but distance. As if I were observing the conversation from slightly above myself. "And how much has he saved?" I asked. Another pause. "Well, he's putting in some." Some. That word again. Flexible, undefined. I realized, in that moment, that the conversation wasn't about helping him. It was about using me. Not maliciously, not cruelly, just efficiently. They weren't debating whether it was appropriate. They were calculating feasibility. And in that calculation, my savings were already a factor. Already included, already available. That's when the shift happened. It wasn't loud, it didn't erupt. It was a quiet internal recalibration. For the first time, I didn't think about whether saying no would make me selfish. I thought about whether saying yes would make me invisible. And I understood something with startling clarity. If I continued absorbing this pattern, it wouldn't stop at this apartment. It would follow me into my 30s, into my 40s, into every major decision I ever tried to make for myself. Because once people build their stability on your quiet compliance, they don't voluntarily dismantle it. That afternoon, sitting alone in my car, I opened my banking app. I looked at the total, still strong, still intact at that point. And instead of pride, I felt exposure. It wasn't just money, it was access. Access they believed they had. access I had never formally revoked. I closed the app. I didn't call her back with an answer right away. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. But I stopped automatically framing myself as part of the solution. For the first time, I considered a possibility that had never fully formed before. What if my silence wasn't strength? What if it was surrender? That night, I took out my leather journal, and instead of recording a transaction, I wrote a sentence across a blank page. Being reliable does not mean being available. It was the first boundary I had ever written down, and even though no one else heard it yet, something fundamental had shifted. Because once you see the role you've been playing, you can't unsee it. And once you stop volunteering for it internally, the next decision becomes different, quieter, sharper, intentional. After that Tuesday, I didn't transform overnight. I didn't storm into my parents' house and announce new rules. I didn't accuse Mateo of irresponsibility. I didn't withdraw love. What I withdrew was an assumption. The next time my mom brought up the apartment, this time with floor plan details and how perfect it would be for Mateo's future, I listened calmly. Then I said, I'm focusing on my own financial goals right now. No explanation, no apology, no counteroffer. Just a statement. There was a brief silence on the other end of the phone. Not dramatic, just unfamiliar. Oh, she said gently. Of course, we just thought, well, you're in a good position. There it was again. Position. As if my savings were a strategic asset on a shared board. I understand, I replied. But I'm not contributing. The words felt steady, not heated, not defensive. And something interesting happened. They didn't argue. They didn't pressure. They adjusted the conversation and moved on. But beneath that surface calm, I sensed recalculation. When you've been predictable for years and suddenly you aren't, people don't explode. They reassess. Over the following weeks, the financial conversation slowed. Not because the needs disappeared, but because my automatic participation did. Mateo still talked excitedly about the apartment. The building had a rooftop pool, a concierge, underground parking. He described it as a breakthrough. I noticed something else. He never asked me directly for money. The requests always came through our parents, which meant I wasn't the sister in his eyes. I was infrastructure, and infrastructures don't require emotional negotiation. They require authorization. So I became very deliberate about silence, not the kind born from fear, the kind born from strategy. I stopped offering financial advice unless directly asked. I stopped reviewing documents unless formally requested. I stopped preemptively solving problems. When my dad called one evening asking if I could quickly take a look at something related to loan paperwork, I said, I'm tied up tonight. You might want to consult a professional. That sentence would have felt unthinkable a year earlier. Now it felt appropriate. They interpreted my restraint as busyness at first, then as independence, then perhaps at a mild distance. But no one accused me, because I wasn't hostile. I was simply unavailable. And here's what I learned. When people mistake your silence for weakness, they reveal how they valued you in the first place. There were subtle shifts in tone during family dinners. My mom began praising Mateo's maturity more frequently. My dad mentioned how impressive it was that he was taking steps toward stability. I didn't contradict them. I didn't agree either. I just observed. Silence, when chosen consciously, is powerful. It removes friction while gathering information. And I was gathering, not to retaliate, to understand the full architecture of what was happening. Because I sensed something bigger than just a down payment conversation. I sensed momentum. And momentum, when unchecked, leads somewhere. I wanted to know where. When people think you're stepping back emotionally, they rarely imagine you're stepping forward strategically. That assumption worked in my favor. From the outside, nothing dramatic changed. I still showed up for birthdays. I still brought wine to Sunday dinners. I still asked Mateo how work was going. I didn't withdraw affection. But privately, I shifted into something else entirely. Observation mode. The first thing I did was something I should have done years earlier. I scheduled a consultation with a financial attorney, not because I planned to sue anyone, not because I was preparing for a confrontation, but because I wanted clarity. I brought copies of old authorization documents, the limited access forms I had signed at 23, the shared account visibility agreements, the secondary contact designations. I asked one simple question: what can legally be moved without my explicit approval? The answer chilled me, more than I had realized. Certain linked transfers, if structured under previously signed joint visibility clauses, could occur without real-time verbal consent, especially if authentication protocols were already established. In other words, what had happened before wasn't a technical glitch. It was possible by design, not illegal, but ethically blurred. I didn't react emotionally in that office. I took notes. I asked about revocation procedures. I asked about audit trails. I asked how to create a clean separation without triggering unnecessary alarms. The attorney gave me a clear roadmap, and I followed it quietly. Over the next month, I began untangling access. Not dramatically, not all at once. I updated authorization levels. I removed secondary access privileges. I shifted long-term savings into a separate institution. I created alerts for any movement over minimal thresholds. I didn't announce any of it, because boundaries don't require performance. Meanwhile, I began documenting past transfers in greater detail: dates, amounts, explanations given, repayment promises, or lack thereof. The total accumulated number surprised even me. Individually, each amount had felt survivable. Together, they formed something else, a pattern of assumed entitlement. At the same time, I started watching something else closely: the apartment process. Mateo talked about it constantly now. Viewings, negotiations, the potential deal, the urgency, the competition from other buyers. What he didn't talk about was the financing structure. Who was co-signing? Who was contributing what? Where the down payment was coming from? And I noticed something subtle in my parents' behavior. They were tense. Not excited, tense. There were hushed conversations in the kitchen, quick glances when I entered a room, a tone of urgency that didn't match the celebration. I didn't accuse. I listened. Then one evening, while helping my mom print something, an innocent enough request, I saw a notification flash briefly on her laptop screen. A large outgoing transfer. The amount matched the number she had mentioned weeks earlier. My stomach didn't drop. It steadied, because this time I wasn't confused. I knew exactly what that number represented, and I knew something else. They weren't just considering using my money. They were counting on it. The difference between suspicion and proof is composure. So instead of confronting her right there, I went home. I logged into my account, and that was the moment. The moment I realized my parents had used my entire life savings to buy a luxury apartment for my brother, without saying a word. Every major deposit I had built over 15 years was gone. Transferred in structured amounts, routed through familiar accounts, authorized under old permissions I had never imagined would be leveraged this way. Everything I had saved was gone, spent on my brother's new home without my knowledge or consent. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stared at the screen until the numbers felt real, and then I opened my journal, not to record a transaction, to begin recording a reckoning. Shock is loud in movies. In real life, it can be eerily quiet. When I saw the zeroed balance, my body didn't collapse. My breath didn't hitch. There was no cinematic moment where the room spun around me. There was only stillness, the kind that happens when something you suspected finally confirms itself. I checked the transaction history line by line. The withdrawals hadn't happened all at once. That would have triggered immediate alerts. Instead, they were structured, staggered transfers over several weeks, amounts just under internal review thresholds, routed through the same linked family account that had once felt harmless. It was deliberate, not impulsive, not emotional, planned. The down payment had cleared 3 days earlier. 3 days, which meant I had sat at dinner with them, listened to Mateo describe the miracle of securing the apartment, and congratulated him, after my savings had already funded it. Without my knowledge, without a single direct conversation, I leaned back in my chair and let the reality settle. The betrayal wasn't only financial, it was structural. They had counted on my silence, on my pattern of understanding, on my history of rationalizing their decisions as temporary, justified, and necessary. They hadn't asked because asking implies the possibility of refusal, and in their minds, refusal wasn't part of the equation. That realization hurt more than the money. But pain, when filtered through clarity, becomes something else. Power, not loud power, not vindictive power, informed power, because here was the truth they hadn't considered. I understood systems, I understood the documentation, and now I understand leverage. The same access structure that allowed those transfers had left a trail. Authorization timestamps, IP logs, authentication methods, every step recorded. It wasn't theft in the criminal sense, but it was a misuse. And misuse creates exposure. I didn't call them that night. I didn't text. Instead, I opened a new document on my laptop. I created a timeline. Date of original authorization signing, age 23. Date of first transfer, $5,000. Verbal explanations given. Subsequent transfers. Repayment gaps. Structured withdrawals for apartment down payment. I wrote everything objectively, no adjectives, no emotion. Facts are stronger when they don't shout. Then I called the bank's escalation department. Calm voice, measured tone. I need a complete transaction audit and authentication log for the past 18 months. The representative asked routine questions. I answered without hesitation. By the end of the call, I had something I hadn't had before. Documentation. And documentation changes dynamics. I wasn't looking to embarrass my parents. I wasn't planning a public confrontation. I didn't want Mateo evicted. But I also wasn't going to remain the silent foundation of a decision I had never consented to. For years, my leverage had been my reliability. Now my leverage was clarity, and clarity doesn't require anger. It requires patience. That night, I slept. Not peacefully, but steadily, because for the first time since the pattern began, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing, and preparation is the opposite of helplessness. They thought I had been unaware. They were wrong. They thought I would absorb this too. That assumption was about to become very expensive. There are moments in life when you realize you're standing at a fork in the road, and no one else can see it but you. This was one of those moments. I had the documentation, I had the audit trail, I had confirmation that the transfers were executed under outdated permissions that I had never explicitly renewed. Legally ambiguous, morally undeniable. I sat at my dining table with 3 options in front of me. Option 1, confront them emotionally, demand explanations, threaten legal action, force immediate repayment. It would feel powerful for about 10 minutes. And then what? Fractured holidays, defensive narratives. Mateo framed as the victim of my coldness. My parents insisted it was a misunderstanding. Years of resentment calcifying into something irreversible. Option 2, do nothing. Absorb it. Accept it as the final cost of being the strong one. Rebuild quietly. Pretend it didn't permanently shift the ground beneath my trust. That option would preserve peace and destroy my self-respect. Option 3, act strategically. No drama, no threats, no public humiliation. Just consequences. I chose the third. Not because I'm vindictive, but because I believe in alignment. If someone makes a decision that involves you without consent, the correction should be just as deliberate and just as structured. The apartment had already closed. The down payment had cleared. My savings were now embedded in that property, which meant something simple. I wasn't just a bystander. I was financially involved, and involvement creates rights. The next morning, I scheduled another meeting with the attorney. This time, I brought the full audit report. We reviewed the transaction structure, the authorization timeline, and the fact that my funds had been used as part of a real estate purchase without my active knowledge at the time of execution. I asked a very specific question. What formal position does this give me? The answer was calm. You have a strong claim to equitable financial interest in the property, especially if the funds are traceable to your sole savings account. Equitable interest, not revenge, not punishment. Interest, meaning documentation could legally establish that a portion of that apartment belonged to me. The attorney explained pathways: a recorded financial claim, a formal repayment structure secured against property equity, or if necessary, a civil action. Though that would escalate matters publicly. I didn't want a public escalation, but I did want formal acknowledgement, because here was the truth that settled in my chest with surprising steadiness. They had treated my life savings as flexible capital. I was going to treat their new asset as a shared liability. No shouting, no accusations, just alignment. That night, I drafted a letter. Not emotional, not accusatory, precise. It outlined the total transferred amount, the timeline, the audit confirmation, and one clear request: a formalized repayment agreement secured by a recorded interest in the apartment. In other words, if my savings built part of that home, my name would be attached to it until every dollar was returned. It wasn't cruelty. It was structured. And structure is something I understand very well. I printed the letter. I placed it inside a simple envelope, and for the first time since discovering the transfers, I felt something stronger than hurt. I felt centered, because I wasn't reacting as the overlooked daughter. I was responding as the owner of what had been taken. The next step would change everything, and it would be irreversible. I didn't deliver the letter in person. I mailed it, certified, signature required, not to intimidate, not to dramatize, to document. There's something powerful about letting paper speak before emotion does. A formal letter forces people to read without interruption, without deflection, without tone manipulation. 3 days after it was delivered, my mother called. Her voice was different, tight, controlled. "Zara, what is this?" No anger, just disbelief. "It's a formal request," I said calmly. "I've documented the transfers. I'm asking for a repayment structure secured against the apartment." There was silence. Then quietly, "You're making this legal?" "I'm making it clear." The distinction mattered. My father got on the line next. His tone wasn't hostile. It was unsettled. "We didn't steal from you. I didn't say you did. You're treating us like strangers." "No," I replied evenly. "I'm treating this like a financial transaction." Because that's what it had been. Not a gift, not an emergency, a class, a transaction but executed without consent. I didn't accuse Mateo. I didn't bring up patterns. I didn't revisit past grievances. I stayed focused on one thing: the money. They tried to soften it. We were going to tell you. They emphasized timing. It all happened so quickly. They framed it as an intention. We knew you'd understand. I let each explanation pass without argument. Understanding is not the same as agreement. At the end of the call, my father said something that told me everything had shifted. We need time to think about this. Of course, I said. Time. The same thing I had never been given before decisions were made. Now the pace was mine. Meanwhile, I moved quietly behind the scenes. The attorney drafted a formal notice of financial claim. Not filed yet, but prepared. If repayment terms weren't established within 30 days, the next step would involve recording my equitable interest, which meant this wasn't emotional leverage. It was structural leverage. I also did something else they didn't anticipate. I froze all previous cross-account privileges permanently and submitted a formal revocation of every shared authorization I had ever signed. No announcement, just execution. Over the next week, I received 3 more calls. One from my mother, tearful but composed. One from my father, defensive but measured. And finally, one from Mateo. His voice carried confusion more than anger. I didn't know it was your whole savings, he said. That sentence told me something important. He hadn't asked. He hadn't verified. He had accepted the support as abstract generosity. Infrastructure doesn't have a face. It was, I replied simply. There was a long pause. I thought Mom and Dad handled it. They did. And that was the truth. I didn't yell. I didn't shame him. I didn't demand apology theatrics. Because this wasn't about emotion. It was about correction. By the end of the second week, my parents asked for a meeting. Not to argue, to negotiate. And that word alone confirmed something profound. They understood I was no longer absorbing this quietly. The silence they once mistook for softness had become something else entirely. Stability. But this time, not for them. For me. We met on a Sunday afternoon. Same dining table, same framed family photos on the wall, same filtered sunlight through the kitchen blinds. But the atmosphere was different. Not explosive, not hostile. Measured. My mother had printed my letter. It lay folded in front of her like something fragile. My father had a notepad. Mateo sat slightly back from the table, unusually quiet. I noticed something immediately. No one dismissed it. No one laughed it off. No one called me dramatic. That alone told me the ground had shifted. My father began. We've reviewed everything. The phrasing was careful, professional almost. He explained that they hadn't intended harm, that they believed I would understand, that the timing of the apartment deal had been urgent, that they had structured the transfers under existing permissions. I nodded. All of that was true. Intent and impact are separate things. Then he said something that revealed the first consequence. We didn't realize how much it totaled. Of course they didn't, because when money flows incrementally from someone who never complains, it feels smaller than it is. I didn't respond emotionally. I simply slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. Total principal, dates, remaining unpaid balances from prior temporary transfers, structured down payment withdrawals. The number sat between us. Heavy. My mother's eyes lingered on it longer than I expected. Mateo leaned forward for the first time. That's all from you? Yes. There was no accusation in my tone, just confirmation. Something subtle changed in that moment. For years, my contributions had been abstract, background, unnamed. Now they were quantified, and numbers don't soften themselves to protect feelings. My father cleared his throat. We can't repay that immediately. I'm not asking for immediate repayment, I said calmly. I'm asking for formal recognition and a secure structure. Again, no heat, just alignment. They had structured the apartment carefully. Mortgage terms, interest rates, inspection contingencies. I was simply asking to be structured into the reality they had built with my money. Mateo spoke again, more quietly this time. If this gets recorded against the property, what does that mean? It means, I answered, that until I'm repaid, my financial interest is legally acknowledged. The word legal landed heavier than anything else, not because it implied war, but because it implied permanence. And permanence makes people reconsider casual decisions. Over the next hour, the conversation shifted from defense to logistics, payment schedules, refinancing options, equity calculations. No one raised their voice, but something else was happening beneath the surface. For the first time in our family dynamic, I wasn't the stabilizer. I was the variable, and uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. That week, small consequences began rippling outward. My mother stopped casually mentioning financial updates. My father became more cautious in his phrasing. Mateo's enthusiasm about the apartment quieted into something more sober. Not resentment, awareness. The system had changed, not because I exploded, but because I formalized. And here's what I learned in that stage. When you attach structure to something people treated casually, they suddenly feel the weight of what they did. Not emotionally, practically. And practical consequences linger longer than arguments ever do. The panic didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in. At first, my parents treated the situation like a solvable inconvenience. They talked about refinancing options. They discussed pulling from retirement funds. They floated ideas about accelerating Mateo's income plans. But reality has a way of tightening quietly. The apartment had been purchased at the top of a competitive market. The mortgage terms were already stretched. Adding a formal recorded financial interest, mine, would complicate future refinancing and resale. Any bank reviewing the property would see it, which meant this wasn't just a private family disagreement. It had external consequences. 2 weeks after our meeting, my father called again. His voice was different this time, not defensive, worried. "The bank is asking questions," he said. "If this gets recorded, it affects the equity position." "Yes," I replied calmly. There was a pause. "We didn't think it would go this far." That sentence lingered. They hadn't thought it would go far because, historically, it never had. Every previous boundary had dissolved under my silence. Every previous overstep had softened into understanding. They weren't prepared for continuity. My mother called the next day, more emotional. "You're dividing the family over money," she said, though not harshly. More like she was trying to convince herself. I took a slow breath before responding. "I'm correcting a financial imbalance." Silence. Then quietly, "We thought you trusted us." I did. That was the part that hurt. Trust is fragile because it depends on mutual recognition. When one side assumes access without renewal, trust doesn't explode. It erodes. Mateo, meanwhile, had started to understand the gravity. He called one evening, his tone stripped of its usual confidence. "If I refinance in a year and pay you back, would you remove the claim?" Yes. No hesitation. Because this was never about punishment. It was about restoration. He exhaled slowly. "I didn't realize they moved all of it." "I know." And I believed him. Mateo had grown up inside the same system I had. He was accustomed to support appearing around him. He didn't question its source. He assumed alignment because alignment had always been manufactured for him. But now, for the first time, that assumption had consequences. Family dinners became quieter. Not hostile, just careful. My parents were polite, respectful, slightly distant, as if recalibrating how to approach me. I noticed something subtle. They stopped saying, "You'll be fine." They started asking, "What are your plans now?" It was a small linguistic shift, but it meant they were beginning to see me not as a fallback system, but as someone with her own trajectory. Still, the apartment stood. Beautiful, modern, rooftop pool, concierge, and now structurally complicated. They couldn't undo the purchase without financial loss. They couldn't erase the paper trail. They couldn't reframe the decision as generosity anymore, because generosity doesn't require documentation to repair. The system they had built, with my money quietly reinforcing it, was now exposed to formal structure. And once structure enters a dynamic that relied on informality, nothing feels casual anymore. They weren't angry, they were unsettled. Because for the first time, I hadn't absorbed the cost, and it was too late to return to the version of me who would have. The final conversation happened in Mateo's new apartment. He invited me over on a Saturday afternoon. The building was exactly as he had described. Polished floors, quiet lobby, filtered sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. It smelled like new paint and expensive detergent. I took the elevator up alone. When he opened the door, he didn't look defensive. He looked older. There's something about financial reality that accelerates maturity. We sat at his kitchen island. No parents this time, no mediators. Just us. "I've been going through the numbers," he began. "If I restructure some things and cut expenses, I can start paying you back faster." I nodded. "That's good." He looked around the apartment for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't ask where the money came from. I just assumed they handled it. I thought, that's what families do." I held his gaze. "Families ask." He absorbed that quietly. There was no dramatic apology, no tears, no raised voices. Just acknowledgement. He walked me through his plan, projected income, adjusted budget, a timeline that was more concrete than anything I'd heard from him in years. It wasn't perfect, but it was accountable. Before I left, he said something I hadn't expected. "I don't want you to feel like this place is a symbol of something taken from you." I considered that carefully. "It's not," I replied. "It's a symbol of a boundary that should have been there." He nodded slowly. When I got home that evening, my parents called separately, not to argue, to clarify repayment logistics. The tone was professional now, structured, precise. No one tried to guilt me anymore. No one accused me of dividing the family. Because something had become undeniable, the confrontation hadn't destroyed anything. It had defined it. There was no emotional explosion to dramatize, no shouting match to replay, just a recalibration of roles. For the first time, I wasn't the silent stabilizer. I was an equal stakeholder. And equality doesn't require heat. It requires clarity. That was the last heavy conversation we had about it. Not because it disappeared, but it was finally positioned correctly. It's been 18 months. The repayment schedule is active, structured, automated. Every month, a transfer arrives. Consistent, documented, intentional, not rushed, not symbolic, real. The first time I saw the repayment notification, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt alignment, not because the money was returning, but because the respect was. Something subtle changed in my family after everything settled. My parents no longer describe me as the one who will be fine. They ask about my plans, and they listen to the answers. When I mentioned I was exploring buying a condo for myself, my father didn't lead with risk analysis. He asked, "How can we support you?" Support, not an assumption, no access. Choice. Mateo has changed too, not dramatically. He's still ambitious, still energetic, but he now pauses before major decisions. He consults, he calculates, he asks questions about long-term implications. Sometimes growth doesn't come from comfort, it comes from consequence. As for me, I did buy that condo. Smaller than his apartment, no rooftop pool, no concierge, but the deed has one name on it, mine, and I keep the framed copy of that deed inside the same leather journal I've been writing in since I was 19. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Because here's what I understand now that I didn't before. Strength without boundaries invites erosion. Silence without intention invites assumption. And love without clarity invites imbalance. I don't resent my family. I don't replay the betrayal with bitterness. They operated within a system we all unconsciously maintained. I simply chose to step out of it. The difference now isn't louder conversations. It's the cleaner ones. I no longer volunteer as contingency. I participate by choice. And that shift, that internal redefinition, changed more than any legal document ever could. I'm still calm, still analytical, still the woman who reads the fine print. But now I read it for myself first. When people hear this story, they often expect a villain. They expect shouting, estrangement, some dramatic final line where I walk away from my family forever. That isn't what happened. What happened was quieter, and in many ways more difficult. I didn't burn the bridge. I reinforced my side of it. The money is being repaid. The paperwork exists. The structure is in place. But the real resolution wasn't financial. It was psychological. For most of my life, I believed being the strong one meant absorbing more, needing less, understanding first, questioning last. I thought reliability required sacrifice without friction. What I've learned is this: reliability without boundaries becomes permission. Generosity without consent becomes extraction. Silence without strategy becomes surrender. The shift in my life didn't begin when the money disappeared. It began the moment I decided my calm would no longer be confused with compliance. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards. And the interesting thing about raising standards is that it doesn't always destroy relationships. Sometimes, it teaches people how to meet you properly for the first time. If you're watching this and you've always been the dependable one, the easy one, the one who will be fine, I want you to consider something gently. Are you being valued, or are you being relied on? There's a difference, and the moment you see it, you can choose how to respond. Not with anger, not with revenge, with clarity. So I'm curious, have you ever realized that your strength was being used instead of respected? And if you did, what did you decide to do about it?